The night was unusually quiet. A light breeze gently moved the leaves outside the small apartment window, and the faint hum of distant traffic was the only sound that broke the stillness. Inside, a young man named Ethan sat on his bed, staring at the ceiling, lost in thought. There was nothing extraordinary about him. He was just like everyone else. Average, unnoticed, living a life that seemed to drift from one day to the next. But Ethan had always felt different, though he could never quite explain why. It wasn't something he often thought about, but on nights like this, when the world seemed so calm and ordinary, those thoughts would return. For as long as he could remember, Ethan had felt an invisible weight on his shoulders. It wasn't the weight of responsibility, nor was it something tangible he could hold in his hands. It was a sense of being owed. Humanity owed him something, though he had no idea why. The feeling had started when he was a child. Whispers in his dreams, strange visions of faces he didn't recognize, and stories of a time long before his birth, when people spoke of sacrifices and promises made in the shadows. These dreams would always end the same way, with the same cryptic words. When the dead is called, you will know. The words echoed in his mind like a ghost, always there, just beyond his understanding. He had tried to ignore them, push them away, and convince himself that they were nothing more than childish fantasies. But deep down, he knew it wasn't just his imagination. There was something more, something real, lurking beneath the surface of his life, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. That moment might have come tonight. Ethan sat up on the bed, rubbing his eyes. The sense of unease had grown stronger over the past few days. Strange things had been happening. At first, it was subtle, small coincidences that he couldn't explain. He would see people staring at him on the street, their eyes just a little too intense, as if they were looking right through him. In his peripheral vision, he would catch flashes of movement, figures that seemed to vanish the moment he turned his head. He had brushed it off as paranoia, but now it was impossible to ignore. The strange feeling of being watched had only grown over time. He had begun to question everything, his daily routine, the people around him, even his own thoughts. But it wasn't just the feeling of being watched that bothered him. It was the constant hum of anticipation, like something was about to happen. He wasn't sure what it was, but it felt important. And more than anything, it felt like it was about him. As if on cue, his phone buzzed on the nightstand. Ethan jumped slightly, his heart racing. He picked it up, glancing at the screen. The message was simple, yet it sent a chill down his spine. The debt is real. You will see soon. The message was from an unknown number. Ethan stared at the words, his mind racing. Who could have sent this? How did they know? For a moment, he just sat there, frozen, the phone trembling in his hands. He wanted to dismiss it as some kind of prank, but deep down, he knew it wasn't. He could feel it in his bones. This was real. The debt was real. But what did it mean? Who had made this debt, and why had it been left for him to settle? Ethan had always wondered about the strange feeling that had followed him throughout his life. Could it be possible that something from his past, something he couldn't remember, was finally coming back to haunt him? Suddenly, his phone buzzed again. This time, the message was different. You are in danger. Trust no one. The truth will find you soon. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest. The feeling of dread was growing stronger, more intense. His mind raced, searching for any connection, any clue that could explain what was happening. But there was nothing. No answers. Only questions, and the overwhelming sensation that something, or someone, was closing in on him. He stood up, pacing around the room, his thoughts a whirlwind of confusion and fear. What was going on? Why was this happening now? And what did the debt have to do with him? The answers were just out of reach, like a puzzle with missing pieces. As he tried to make sense of it all, the air in the room seemed to grow heavier. The walls felt like they were closing in, the silence too oppressive. His breath quickened, and he glanced at the window. The streetlights outside seemed dimmer, and the shadows in the corners of the room seemed to shift and move. Was he losing his mind? Or was something truly happening? Suddenly, his phone buzzed again, this time with a call. Ethan hesitated before answering, his hand trembling as he swiped the screen. "Ethan, listen to me carefully," a voice said, low and urgent. It was a woman's voice, one he didn't recognize, but it sounded familiar, almost like someone he had known in another life. "You're in grave danger. The debt that humanity owes you is coming due. You need to get out of there, right now." Ethan's heart skipped a beat. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught in his throat. Before he could respond, the voice continued. "They're watching you. They know who you are. The time is almost here. You need to leave, and you need to be prepared. Trust no one, not even your closest friends. The truth will be revealed soon, but until then, stay hidden. And whatever you do, don't trust the people who come for you. They aren't who they say they are." The call ended abruptly, leaving Ethan stunned and breathless. He stood there in the middle of the room, trying to process everything he had just heard. Who was that woman? How did she know so much about him? And what did she mean by the debt? His mind raced, but the answers were still elusive. He glanced around the room, his gaze falling on the small stack of books on his desk. They were all science fiction novels, stories about space, time travel, and humanity's place in the universe. He had always been drawn to these books, fascinated by the idea of something bigger than himself, something far beyond the world he knew. But now, as he stood there in the silence, the stories felt different. They didn't feel like fantasy anymore. They felt like a warning. The feeling in his gut grew stronger. The weight of the debt was real. It was no longer just a vague feeling he had carried with him for years. It was a promise, a curse, a responsibility. And it was coming for him. He couldn't shake the thought that somehow, everything he had experienced, every strange dream, every odd feeling, had led to this moment. The debt was real. And whatever was coming next would change his life forever. Ethan didn't know who to trust or what to do, but he knew one thing for sure. He couldn't stay here. The world around him had changed, and soon he would have to face whatever it was that had been waiting for him all these years. As he grabbed his jacket and headed toward the door, a strange sense of determination settled over him. Whatever was coming, he would face it head-on. He didn't know how, and he didn't know why, but the truth was calling, and he was ready to answer. The only question now was, would he be ready for the unimaginable? The clock on the wall ticked relentlessly, echoing in the otherwise silent room. Ethan's heart was racing. It was as if the world was slowly collapsing into itself, and he was at the center of it, lost in the chaos. Everything was happening too quickly, and yet the more he tried to think clearly, the more confused he became. Each passing second felt like an eternity. The strange message, the phone call, none of it made sense. But there was one undeniable fact that Ethan couldn't shake. Something big was coming, something that involved him. The weight of the unknown hung heavy over his mind. What was this debt? Why did humanity owe him? And more importantly, why was it all coming to a head now, after so many years of quiet uncertainty? His apartment felt claustrophobic, the walls closing in on him as the questions spun around in his mind. He needed answers, but he had no idea where to find them. The woman's warning about being in danger felt real, too real. He couldn't risk staying in his apartment. Whoever, or whatever, was coming for him could already be on their way. Without another thought, Ethan grabbed his jacket and headed out of his apartment. The cool night air hit him as he stepped outside, and for a moment, he felt like he could breathe again. The city was quiet, too quiet for a place that was usually buzzing with activity. The usual sounds of cars, distant conversations, and the hum of the city were all strangely muted. It was as if the whole world was holding its breath. Ethan glanced over his shoulder, as though expecting someone to be following him. The sense of being watched hadn't gone away. If anything, it was more intense now. His instincts screamed that he was not alone. The streets were dimly lit, the occasional streetlight casting long, eerie shadows on the pavement. Ethan quickened his pace, unsure of where he was going but knowing he couldn't stay in one place for too long. His mind raced as he tried to make sense of everything that had happened. The cryptic messages, the woman's call. What was it all leading to? And why was he the one involved? It felt as if the answers were just beyond his reach, waiting for him to figure them out. His phone buzzed again, interrupting his thoughts. Ethan froze, his fingers trembling as he looked down at the screen. The message was from the same unknown number. "They're here. Don't trust anyone. The truth is closer than you think." A cold chill ran down his spine. The voice on the other end of the phone had sounded so urgent, so desperate. And now, it seemed like the woman's warning was coming true. Whoever they were here. But who were they? Was it the aliens? Was it something even worse? The possibilities seemed endless, and none of them were comforting. Ethan glanced around again, this time more carefully. The streets were still empty, but something didn't feel right. A figure stood at the end of the block, partially obscured in shadow. For a moment, Ethan thought it was just his mind playing tricks on him, but then the figure moved. It was slow, deliberate, and it was coming closer. His heart hammered in his chest as he instinctively took a few steps back. He didn't know who or what this person was, but the feeling of danger was unmistakable. Was this one of them? Was this person here to take him, to settle the debt? Ethan's hand instinctively reached for his phone, but he hesitated. There was no time to call anyone. Whoever this was, they were moving fast, and Ethan needed to stay one step ahead. Without thinking, Ethan turned and ducked down a side alley, his breath coming in quick bursts. His footsteps echoed in the narrow, empty space. The figure was still behind him, moving faster now. It was getting closer. Panic surged through him, and his mind raced for a plan, any plan, to get away. But the alley seemed to stretch on forever, and the more he ran, the more the darkness seemed to close in around him. He glanced over his shoulder again. The figure was no longer in sight, but that only made Ethan more nervous. He knew that whoever it was had to be close, too close. Suddenly, a voice broke the silence, low and cold. "You can't run, Ethan." The word stopped him dead in his tracks. He whipped around to face the source of the voice, but there was no one there. Just the shadows, stretching long across the alleyway. A shiver ran down his spine. He wasn't alone. Whoever was after him was playing with him, toying with his every move. And yet there was something oddly familiar about the voice. It felt as though he had heard it before, in one of his dreams, perhaps. Was it possible? Had he dreamed of this moment? Or was this just a trick of his mind, pushed to the edge by the stress and fear? Before he could make sense of anything, a figure stepped out from the shadows, tall, cloaked in black, their face hidden beneath the hood. The air around them seemed to distort, and a cold wind swirled through the alley. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. "You've been chosen," the figure said again, their voice as icy as the wind. "Humanity owes you a debt, and now it's time to pay." Ethan took a step back, his heart pounding. This wasn't a dream. This was real. The debt was real, and the time had come. But why him? Why now? What do you want from me?" Ethan asked, his voice trembling. "What debt? What do you mean?" The figure stepped closer, the shadows around them deepening, their presence overwhelming. "Everything, Ethan. Everything you've ever known has led to this moment. Humanity owes you, and the time to collect has arrived." Ethan swallowed hard, his mind a blur. The figure was right. This was all connected to him. But how? Why him? What had he done to deserve this? To be the one caught in the middle of some grand, mysterious debt? "There's no way out," the figure continued, their voice now sharp and final. "The debt is a chain that cannot be broken. It's time for you to fulfill your part." Before Ethan could respond, the figure raised a hand, and suddenly, Everything around him shifted. The world blurred, colors bleeding together, and for a brief moment, Ethan felt like he was floating in a void. Then, with a snap, reality seemed to snap back into place. But now, the streets were different. The city around him looked unfamiliar, twisted, as though he had been transported to another time, another world. Ethan stumbled, disoriented. What had just happened? Where was he? And why did it feel like everything around him was out of place? The truth was closer than he thought, but the more he tried to understand, the further away it seemed. One thing was clear: the time for questions was over. The debt was here, and he had no choice but to face it. The only question that remained was, what would he be forced to do to pay it? The world around Ethan felt like it was bending, stretching in ways that defied reason. His feet struggled to stay steady on the unfamiliar ground beneath him. Everything had shifted in an instant. One moment he was in the familiar alleyway. The next, the city around him was a shadow of what it had been. The buildings loomed unnaturally tall, their surfaces cracked and worn, as though they had been standing for centuries. The air was thick with a metallic scent, and the faint hum of technology buzzed in the distance, far louder than the peaceful quiet he was used to. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest. His legs felt weak, his mind racing as he tried to make sense of what had just happened. He looked around, his breath quickening as confusion washed over him. This wasn't just an empty alley anymore. The streets were eerily quiet, not a soul in sight. Only the faintest traces of movement, a flickering shadow here, a strange shape in the distance, suggested that anything or anyone was even nearby. He didn't know where he was. This didn't feel like his world. The feeling of dread that had been building in his chest since he had first received the strange messages intensified with each passing second. It was as if he had been dropped into a nightmare that he couldn't escape, and no matter how hard he tried to understand it, the truth was slipping further out of reach. Ethan's mind was still trying to process everything. The call, the messages, the figure in the alley. Humanity owed him a debt. But what kind of debt could be so powerful, so significant, that it would send him to a place like this? And why had he been chosen? He took a deep breath, forcing himself to focus. Panic wasn't going to help him now. He needed to think. He needed to find answers, and fast. There was something about this place that made him feel small, insignificant, like he didn't belong. The longer he stood there, the more it felt like the world was closing in on him. But he couldn't stay frozen in place. He needed to move. Ethan started walking, his footsteps echoing eerily in the silence. The streets stretched out in front of him, like a maze with no end in sight. He couldn't shake the feeling that someone, was watching him. He glanced over his shoulder, but the shadows remained still, unchanging. It was like the city itself was alive, waiting for him to make a move. As he walked, he noticed something odd. There were no cars, no signs of life at all, except for the occasional flicker of light or strange hum from the buildings around him. It felt like he was the last person left in this world, and the emptiness around him made the air feel suffocating. His thoughts were interrupted by a faint sound, a soft whisper, barely audible above the hum of the strange city. He froze, his ears straining to catch the words. It was impossible to tell where the voice was coming from, but it felt close, like it was right behind him. You cannot escape. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. He spun around, but there was no one there. The whisper had come from nowhere, and it was gone as quickly as it had arrived. He swallowed hard, trying to steady his nerves. Who was that? Was it the same voice he had heard on the phone? Or was it something else entirely? There was no time to dwell on it. He couldn't let fear control him. He needed to find answers. Ethan continued to walk, determined, but his pace had slowed. His mind was still racing, piecing together fragments of the puzzle. The debt, the figure in the alley, the strange city. Everything was connected, but the connection was elusive, just out of reach. As he turned a corner, something caught his eye. A faint light flickered ahead, the first real sign of life he had seen since he had arrived in this strange place. It wasn't much, just a small, dimly lit building at the end of the street, but it felt like a beacon of hope in the midst of the darkness. He could feel it calling to him, urging him to come closer. He needed to investigate. He needed to understand what was going on. Ethan quickened his pace, the faint light growing brighter as he approached. As he got closer, the building began to take shape. It looked like an old storefront, but its design was unlike anything he had ever seen. The windows were covered in grime, and the door appeared to be rusted shut. But there was something about it, something that made him feel like this was the place where his answers lay. He hesitated for a moment, his hand hovering over the door. Something told him to turn back, to leave this place, and try to figure things out on his own. But the pull of the unknown was stronger. He pushed the door open, the creak of old wood echoing in the silence as he stepped inside. The air inside the building was cold, the scent of dust and age hanging heavily in the air. Ethan's eyes adjusted to the dim light, and he saw shelves lined with old books, strange artifacts, and objects he couldn't begin to identify. It felt like a place out of time, as though he had stepped into another world entirely. As he moved deeper into the room, he felt the weight of the space pressing in on him. The silence was suffocating. But then, from the far corner of the room, a voice broke the stillness. "You've come." Ethan's body tensed, his heart leaping into his throat. He spun around, and there, in the shadows, stood another figure, this one shrouded in a long, flowing cloak. The figure's face was hidden, but the presence was unmistakable. This was the person or being that had been waiting for him. This was the one who had called him here. The figure stepped forward, the sound of their footsteps muffled by the thick dust on the floor. The voice that had spoken to him earlier came again, this time more distinct, more real. "You know why you're here, don't you, Ethan?" Ethan swallowed, his mouth dry. "No, I don't. I don't understand. Why am I here? What do you want from me?" The figure tilted its head slightly, as if considering him. "What we want is simple. Humanity owes you a debt that can no longer be ignored." Ethan's pulse quickened. "What debt? I don't understand. What does this have to do with me?" The figure stepped even closer, the air around them growing colder. "You were chosen. Long ago, a promise was made, a promise that humanity would not forget. And now, that promise must be fulfilled." Ethan's mind spun. A promise? A debt? What was all of this leading to? He couldn't piece the puzzle together, no matter how hard he tried. But there was one thing he was certain of. The answers were here, in this room, with this mysterious figure. He had to understand, and he had to act, because whatever this debt was, it was coming for him. "You're the key, Ethan," the figure said softly. "But the question is, will you accept the truth? Will you embrace the debt, or will you fight against it? Your choice will shape everything." Ethan's heart hammered in his chest. Fight against it. What choice did he have? How could he possibly fight against something so huge, so deeply connected to the very fabric of reality? He didn't know what to do. But one thing was clear. The time for questions was over. The time for answers was now. And whatever came next, he would have to face it. There was no turning back. Ethan's head spun as the figure's words echoed in his mind. "You're the key." The weight of the statement was too much to process, and yet a strange sense of inevitability settled over him. Whatever this debt was, whatever was coming for him, it was far beyond his control. The figure stood in the shadowed corner of the room, unmoving, waiting for him to speak. The air between them crackled with tension, as though the very space they occupied was holding its breath. Ethan's mouth felt dry, his thoughts chaotic. His legs, though shaky, somehow held him steady. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. How could he even begin to respond to something this impossible? Why me? Ethan finally managed to ask, his voice barely above a whisper. Why have I been chosen for this debt? I don't understand. The figure's cloak swirled slightly as it stepped forward, its face still obscured. The atmosphere grew colder as it neared. Long before your birth, a pact was made, a promise between humans and those who came before, a promise of protection, of power in exchange for a future debt. Your lineage was chosen to carry the weight of that promise. The voice was soft, but commanding, each word heavy with meaning. And now that debt has come due. Ethan's pulse quickened. A pact. A debt so ancient that it was tied to his very existence. The pieces were coming together, but they weren't fitting neatly. What could this debt be? What power could humanity possibly owe? Unjust. Me? Ethan said, still struggling to process the words. I've never done anything special. I've never even asked for anything. The figure tilted its head, as though considering his words carefully. You don't need to have done anything, Ethan. The debt is not something you earned. It is something that was placed upon you long before you were born. You are the vessel through which humanity's fate will unfold. Everything you've experienced, your dreams, the sense of being watched, was the debt preparing you for this moment. A cold shiver ran down Ethan's spine as the gravity of the situation began to settle in. He wasn't just caught in the middle of a strange, confusing event. He was at the center of something much larger, something that involved the very future of humanity, and he had no idea what it meant or how he could control it. But what does it mean for me? Ethan asked, feeling a knot tighten in his chest. What am I supposed to do with this debt? What's going to happen? The figure's voice dropped to a whisper, its tone dark and grave. The time is drawing near, Ethan. The forces that seek to collect the debt are already moving. Your role in this has been set in motion. Whether you fight or whether you comply, you will have to face the consequences of this promise. The future of humanity depends on how you choose to proceed. Ethan felt his stomach drop. The weight of the figure's words hung heavily in the air. The future of humanity. He was just one person. How could his actions possibly have that kind of power? He was no hero. He was no chosen one. Just an ordinary guy who had gotten caught in something beyond his understanding. Who are these forces? Ethan asked, desperate for any shred of information that could make sense of all of this. Who is coming for me? The figure took a slow, deliberate step forward. For the first time, it spoke with a cold certainty that chilled Ethan to his bones. They are the ones who've always watched. The ones who shaped the world without you ever knowing. They are not human, Ethan. They are the ones who hold the debt, and they've come to collect. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. Not human. He could barely process the implications. What do you mean? Who are they? The figure remained silent for a moment before responding, its voice now carrying an eerie calm. They are the ones who altered humanity's path, who set this debt in motion. They are not like us. They are the ones who gave humanity the gift of power, and now they come to reclaim it. Ethan's mind raced as he tried to grasp the enormity of what the figure was telling him. His entire life had been shaped by something he hadn't even known existed. And now, the forces that had influenced humanity's rise and fall were preparing to take everything back. Was he really the key? Could he really stop them? The room around him felt as though it were closing in, pressing down on him with an invisible force. Ethan's chest tightened. Every instinct told him to run, to get out of this place, to escape from whatever was coming. But there was nowhere to run. The debt wasn't just something he could outrun. It was a part of him now. Can I stop them? Ethan asked, his voice hoarse. The figure's gaze, though hidden, seemed to linger on him for a long moment. That is not for me to say. But know this, Ethan. The choice is yours. You can either accept your fate and take up the mantle of your lineage, or you can fight against it. But the consequences of that fight will be far more than you can imagine. The room grew even colder as the figure's words sank in. Ethan felt his mind spinning. There was no easy answer. The forces that had created this debt were ancient, powerful, far beyond anything he could comprehend. And now, they were coming for him. His legs felt weak, his mind struggling to process the magnitude of what he had just learned. The weight of the figure's words pressed down on him. He wasn't just a pawn in some cosmic game. He was a player, a key to something bigger than he could ever have imagined. And the consequences of his choices could change everything. As the figure moved to leave, its voice reached him one final time, soft and haunting. "You'll know soon enough, Ethan. The truth will come, and when it does, there will be no turning back." Ethan's heart raced as the figure vanished into the shadows, leaving him alone in the cold, dark room. His thoughts were a whirlwind, spinning faster than he could follow. He had been thrust into a world of secrets, of ancient debts and mysterious forces, and now there was no way out. The choices he made from here on out would shape everything. Ethan took a deep breath, steadying himself as the realization began to settle in. He was no longer just a man. He was a part of something much, much bigger. And the truth, as terrifying as it was getting closer with each passing moment. He had to face it. There was no turning back now. Ethan stood there in the cold, dimly lit room, his mind a storm of thoughts. The figure had disappeared into the shadows, leaving him alone with the weight of the revelation. The truth, the debt, the forces that were coming for him. None of it made sense. But one thing was clear. Nothing in his life was going to be the same. The reality he had known had shattered, and now he was standing at the precipice of something he couldn't yet fully understand. The silence around him was suffocating, the air thick with the weight of the moment. Ethan didn't know what to do next. He didn't know where to go. The figure had said he had a choice, but the cost of that choice wasn't something he could comprehend. Could he fight against these forces? Could he somehow stop the debt from being collected? Or would he have to accept his fate and walk the path that had been laid out for him, whether he wanted to or not? His heart pounded in his chest as he tried to steady his thoughts. The room around him felt colder, the walls closing in like the very air was pressing in on him. He needed answers. He needed to find out what was really happening. But where could he turn? Who could he trust? The figure had said the forces were not human. Whatever they were beyond anything Ethan had ever encountered. The idea of an ancient debt tied to his bloodline made him feel as though he was drowning in a world he didn't belong to, a world where he was being pulled into something far beyond his control. His whole life had been built on ordinary, simple things, and now it felt like the universe was turning upside down. Ethan's gaze flicked around the room, searching for something, anything, that might make sense of the situation. His eyes landed on the dusty shelves filled with ancient books, strange artifacts, and peculiar objects. There had to be something here, something that could help him understand what was going on. He couldn't afford to be ignorant anymore. He had to learn everything he could, and fast. Moving toward the nearest shelf, Ethan began to examine the books, his fingers brushing over the spines. Most of them were old, the leather cracked and worn. The titles faded and almost illegible, but there was one book that stood out. It was sitting slightly apart from the others, its cover embossed with a symbol Ethan didn't recognize. It wasn't the typical ornate design of an old manuscript. This symbol was sharp, angular, almost as if it were carved into the book itself. Curiosity overtook him, and he reached for the book. As soon as his fingers made contact, a sudden jolt ran through him, as though the book had a life of its own. He pulled his hand back, startled, but then, after a moment of hesitation, he opened the cover. The pages inside were filled with strange writing, symbols, diagrams, and text in languages he couldn't decipher. His heart raced again, but there was something about the book, something about the way it felt, that made him think it was the key to understanding everything. He flipped through the pages frantically, trying to make sense of it all. Some of the diagrams resembled star maps, others appeared to show complex systems of energy. One page seemed to depict a massive structure, towering and alien, surrounded by an aura of light. Another page had a drawing of a figure, tall, cloaked, and otherworldly, standing before a gathering of people. Could this be what the figure had meant? Was this the force that humanity had owed the debt to? As Ethan turned the pages, something caught his eye. A passage written in a language that, strangely enough, seemed familiar, as if the words were calling to him. He couldn't explain it, but he felt like he understood them, as if his mind was unlocking something buried deep within him. The passage spoke of an ancient promise made between the first humans and an otherworldly race, beings who had shared knowledge and power with humanity in exchange for a debt that would one day be called in. The debt was tied to a specific lineage, a bloodline that carried the key to the promise, a key that could either be used to fulfill the terms of the agreement or break it. And as Ethan's eyes moved across the words, the realization hit him with crushing force. The lineage, the bloodline, it was his. It was his family, his ancestors, who had made this pact. And now it was his turn to bear the weight of that debt. His breathing grew shallow as the full scope of his situation began to sink in. He wasn't just some random person caught in a cosmic game. He was a part of a larger plan, a crucial player in an ancient drama. The debt wasn't something he could escape. It was embedded in his very DNA. He had been chosen, whether he wanted to be or not. But what could he do now? The book offered no answers about how to break the pact, how to fight against the forces that were coming for him. It was clear that the time for action was nearing. But what action? How could he possibly stand against something so vast, so powerful? He closed the book with a sharp snap, the weight of the decision ahead of him pressing down on him like a physical force. A low hum filled the air, vibrating through the ground beneath his feet. The temperature in the room dropped even further, and Ethan instinctively stepped back. The walls of the room seemed to shift, bending, warping as though they were no longer real. The air around him buzzed with an unnatural energy. And then, there it was, a soft, almost imperceptible whisper. "You can't run, Ethan. The debt is coming, and it's already too late." Ethan's heart froze in his chest. The voice was unmistakable. It was the same voice he had heard earlier, in the alley and on the phone. The forces were here. They were already moving. "Why don't you come with us, Ethan?" The voice continued, this time not from the shadows, but from all around him. "You've been chosen. There's no need to fight. It's time to fulfill your part. Embrace your legacy, and all will be revealed." The voice grew louder, more insistent, as though it was everywhere at once. Ethan's mind raced. Could he really accept this? Could he just give in and embrace whatever was coming? The weight of the decision bore down on him harder than ever before. But then, something inside him, something deep within his core, stirred. He wasn't ready to just accept this. Not yet. Ethan's fists clenched, a surge of defiance rising within him. No matter how much the universe tried to pull him into its web, no matter how much these forces tried to control him, he wasn't going to just let it happen. He wasn't going to just give in to fate. He turned toward the door, steeling himself. "I'm not going down without a fight," he muttered to himself. The whispering voice faded, replaced by an oppressive silence. But the hum in the air remained, buzzing around him, growing louder. It was time for him to make his move. Ethan stepped forward, his pulse hammering in his chest. The hum in the air grew louder, vibrating through his bones. He couldn't let it go on any longer. The forces, those mysterious, otherworldly beings, were closing in, and he wasn't about to sit idly by and accept his fate. There had to be a way to fight back. He couldn't let humanity's future rest on his shoulders alone without even understanding the full scope of the debt that had been placed upon him. As he moved through the room, the oppressive silence seemed to press down even harder, thick and suffocating. It was as though the very walls were watching him, judging him. Ethan gritted his teeth. There was no time to waste. He had to figure out how to break the hold this debt had on him, how to push back against whatever these forces were. But where could he go? Who could he trust? The figure had said there was no turning back, but Ethan wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. The door to the strange, dimly lit room creaked open as he pushed it forward, the sound echoing in the heavy silence. The hallway outside was just as eerie as the room he had left behind, cold, barren, and empty. Yet there was a sense of movement just beyond the edges of his vision, like something was waiting for him. Watching. He moved cautiously, his footsteps soft but deliberate. The hall stretched out before him like an endless tunnel, the darkness pressing in from all sides. He could feel the tension building around him. Something was coming. He could feel it in the pit of his stomach. Whatever had been set in motion, whatever forces were after him, were closing in. But he wasn't going to run. Not this time. As he reached the end of the hallway, he noticed a faint light flickering through a crack in the door ahead of him. It was different from the dim light that had filled the room. This was warmer, inviting, almost comforting. He approached cautiously, the familiar feeling of uncertainty rising again. What would he find on the other side? Ethan took a deep breath, pushing open the door. The room he stepped into was a stark contrast to the one he had just left. It was bright, almost blindingly so, with large windows letting in natural sunlight. There was a soft hum in the air, but this time, it was not oppressive. It was peaceful. The room was filled with bookshelves, each one stacked high with books, but these were not the ancient tomes he had seen earlier. These were books of all kinds, ranging from thick academic volumes to lighter fiction, their spines worn from use. In the center of the room sat a large desk, cluttered with papers, a laptop, and a few other odd objects. But it wasn't the desk that caught Ethan's attention. It was the figure sitting behind it. It was a woman, older than him by a few years, with sharp features and dark, piercing eyes that seemed to see right through him. She was sitting with her arms crossed, her expression unreadable. Her presence was calm but authoritative, and despite the warmth of the room, there was something unsettling about her. She looked up as he entered, her gaze locking onto his immediately. "I've been expecting you," she said, her voice steady but laced with an undeniable intensity. "You've taken the first step, Ethan. Now you have a choice to make." Ethan took a hesitant step forward. "Who are you? What is this place?" The woman smiled faintly, though there was no warmth in it. "I'm someone who knows more about the debt than you can imagine. And this," she gestured around the room, "is a safe space. For now. But don't think for a second that means you're safe from what's coming." Ethan's heart skipped a beat. "You mean the forces? The ones who want to collect the debt?" She nodded. "Yes. And they're close. Very close." She stood, moving around the desk toward him. "But that's not the whole story, Ethan. You're not just a pawn in this. You've been chosen, yes, but you also have a power within you that you've yet to understand. A power that can change everything." The words hit Ethan like a shockwave. A power within him. What did she mean? He had no special abilities, no hidden strength. He was just a regular guy, thrust into a situation beyond his understanding. "What are you talking about?" he asked, his voice tense with frustration. "I'm not special. I don't have any power." She gave him a piercing look, her eyes narrowing slightly. "That's what they want you to believe. But deep within you, Ethan, lies something unique, something tied to the very origins of this debt. You've been chosen because you hold the key to humanity's future, but it's up to you to unlock it." The room seemed to grow colder again, the air thick with the weight of her words. "And if I can't unlock it? If I don't have the power you're talking about?" The woman's face softened, though her eyes still held that calculating intensity. "Then the debt will be paid, and everything you know will be lost. These forces don't care about your confusion. They care about one thing, their payment. And if they get what they want, nothing will be the same." Ethan's mind spun. The weight of her words pressed on him, each one digging deeper into his already fragile sense of control. What was he supposed to do? How could he unlock some hidden power within himself? How could he fight forces that were so far beyond him? But how? He asked, his voice breaking through the chaos of his thoughts. How do I unlock this power? What am I supposed to do? The woman's expression softened, a touch of sympathy crossing her face. The answer isn't something I can give you, Ethan. It's something you'll have to discover for yourself. You have to choose to embrace it. And when you do, you'll understand. Her words hung in the air like a challenge, and Ethan felt the weight of them, pressing against his chest. He had no idea what was coming next. He didn't even know how to begin unlocking whatever this power was. But one thing was certain, he couldn't run anymore. He was in this, whether he was ready or not. The woman gave him one last look, and her voice took on a quiet urgency. You don't have much time. The forces will find you soon. And when they do, you'll have to be ready. Because what happens next will determine everything. Ethan stood still, the reality of the situation settling over him like a heavy cloak. His entire life, his future, humanity's future, it all depended on what he did next. There was no more running, no more waiting. He had to face whatever was coming. And somehow, he had to find a way to unlock the power inside him before it was too late. Ethan felt the weight of the woman's words pressing down on him, as if the very air around him had become too thick to breathe. The sense of urgency in her voice hadn't been lost on him. It was clear. Time was running out, and he had no idea how to unlock whatever power she was talking about. He was just an ordinary guy. At least he thought he was. How could he possibly be the key to humanity's survival? The woman stared at him for a long moment, her eyes intense, as though searching for some sign that he understood what was at stake. You don't have to believe me now, she said, her voice softening just a little. But know this. The truth is in you. It's been inside you all along. You just need to tap into it. Ethan's mind raced. But how? He asked, his voice shaky. How do I tap into it? The woman didn't answer right away. Instead, she walked over to a large bookshelf that dominated one side of the room. Her fingers traced the spines of the books, almost reverently, before she selected one at random. She turned and handed it to Ethan. Everything you need to know is in here, she said, her voice quiet but firm. The knowledge you'll need to understand your lineage, the debt, and most importantly, the power you hold within. You won't find the answers anywhere else. It's all here. Ethan took the book, its leather cover cool and firm in his hands. It looked ancient, its edges worn and frayed, as if it had been passed down through generations. The title was written in a language he couldn't recognize, but something about it felt familiar. As though the very presence of the book stirred something deep within him, some distant memory he couldn't quite place. The woman's voice interrupted his thoughts. You can't waste time, Ethan. The forces are already closing in. They're watching you. You'll need to read this carefully. When you're ready, it will guide you to what you need to do next. Ethan nodded, though a part of him still didn't understand what was happening. How could one book change everything? How could he, a regular person, suddenly be thrust into something this huge? Before he could ask any more questions, the door behind him creaked open. Ethan whipped around, his heart racing. Standing in the doorway was another figure, tall, cloaked in shadow. This one was different from the first figure he had encountered. There was something unsettling about this one, something that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. The woman in the room didn't flinch at the appearance of the new figure. Instead, she sighed heavily, her expression growing darker. You were right on time, she said, as though expecting this moment. The figure stepped fully into the room, and its presence filled the space. Ethan could feel the air grow even colder. The man, or whatever it was silent, watching him with a piercing gaze that seemed to weigh him down, as though it could see every thought running through his mind. Ethan. The man finally spoke, his voice low and gravelly. You are not ready. You're still blind to your destiny. Ethan's chest tightened. He tried to speak, but the words caught in his throat. Who was this person? What did he mean by destiny? The woman moved toward the figure. "He's as ready as he'll ever be," she said with a sharpness in her tone. "He has no choice now. The time is upon us." Ethan couldn't help it. He had to ask, "Who are you? What do you want from me?" The cloaked figure finally looked at him, his eyes glinting with cold certainty. "What we want, Ethan, is for you to accept your purpose. You are the key to fulfilling the ancient debt. The power within you, the power of your bloodline, is what will tip the scales, and that power is awakening. Whether you choose to embrace it or not, it is stirring. And when it does, you will be ready." "Ready for what?" Ethan asked, stepping back instinctively. "What's going to happen?" The figure smiled, a cruel, empty smile. "That, young one, is something only you can answer." Ethan felt a shiver run down his spine. Every word that man spoke made the situation feel even more impossible. He was the key to some ancient debt. His bloodline was somehow tied to this cosmic struggle, and now he had to decide what to do with that knowledge. It was too much. He was just an ordinary person, wasn't he? The woman spoke again, her voice gentle but firm. "You are not ordinary, Ethan. You were born for this. You are part of something much larger than yourself. And now, it's time to decide. Will you fight, or will you let this debt be settled, and everything you know be lost?" Ethan's mind raced. He had never asked for any of this. He just wanted to live his life. He wasn't a hero, but the weight of the choice in front of him was undeniable. If he walked away from this, would the world, would humanity, pay the price? Could he stand by and let whatever forces were after him take control? "You don't have time to think," the cloaked figure interjected, his voice cold as ice. "The decision must be made now. The forces are already gathering. And once they come for you, there will be no more choices left." A chill ran through Ethan's bones. He could feel it in the pit of his stomach. The pressure, the looming threat of something beyond his understanding, closing in on him. The weight of the world felt like it was resting on his shoulders. The woman looked at Ethan, her eyes filled with an understanding he didn't fully comprehend. "You must decide, Ethan. Embrace the power within you, or let it consume you. But know this, if you don't act, the debt will be collected, and the forces who seek it will not be kind." Ethan felt something stir within him. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, like the faintest whisper at the edge of his consciousness. The power she spoke of, the power locked within him, was beginning to stir, like the rumblings of something vast and ancient that had been buried deep within his soul. Was it possible? Could he really have this power inside of him? He reached for the book in his hands, his fingers trembling as he opened it. The ancient text seemed to pulse under his fingertips, as though it was alive, waiting for him to uncover its secrets. His eyes scanned the pages, the words slowly starting to make sense, the symbols beginning to connect in his mind. It was like a key unlocking a door that had always been there. The room around him seemed to shift. The temperature dropped again, but now it was different. There was a sense of power growing inside him. He could feel it surging within him, a force that had been waiting, dormant, all his life. The decision was clear now. He had no choice but to fight. He had no choice but to embrace this destiny, this debt, and use the power within him to protect humanity, or risk everything being lost. As the figures in the room watched him, Ethan's gaze hardened. The time for indecision had passed. The forces were closing in, and he was ready to face them. "Let's see what I'm truly capable of," he muttered to himself, stepping forward with a newfound resolve. The journey ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time, Ethan felt ready to fight, ready to embrace the power that had always been inside him. And whatever came next, he would face it head on.